would get upfront. In 16, I left Press and I joined PointRight. And PointRight is a completely different game. I really wanted to do something different in my career. Back to Andrew's point, sort of go back to a more technical role than what I had at the time. Even being CTO at Presbyterian, I didn't feel like I had my hands dirty enough. And I wanted to get more into analytics. So I joined PointRight, a small shop, went from big organizations to one that had 70 employees based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I traveled for 4 years. I've been traveling between Albuquerque until this pandemic hit, and working with a SaaS platform that is a predictive analytics platform used in post-acute care. So skilled nursing facilities, about 2,500 all over the country, use our platform to submit what's called minimum data set assessments. We run a bunch of predictive models in near real time, and we present patient level and facility level performance information and clinical indicators that help clinicians take care of those patients. One of the things that we have done recently at PointRight that does involve New Mexico, I thought I would mention that, is that we have this partnership with the state government, with Presbyterian, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and Western Sky, so all of the health plans that support the managed Medicaid program in New Mexico. And we now have all of the skilled nursing facilities in the state submitting their clinical assessments to PointRight and receiving our analytics in return. We also calculate facility measures for the whole state, and we allow the state to then divvy up the monies that are set aside through these programs for facilities that perform well in quality of care. So great way to take a completely SaaS model to integrate clinical data from a bunch of healthcare providers and to reward for quality and not just for volume of service, all based on analytics and what we're calling big data here. So yeah, I've been around for a while. I have looked at analytics from different perspectives in a couple of different industries, and have really fell in love with this notion of marrying value and analytics. So let's start with, I said I was going to go back to where I first met value. So I was working at the brewery. I was probably in my early 20s as a junior developer. And at that point, I really could care less about value. And I think a lot of people that find themselves in technical roles or in technology roles, they start like that. I mean, they fall in love with the technology. That was my thing. I was so happy just coding that I really could care less what those things were being used for. I was actually surprised that they were paying me what they were paying me because I was having so much fun doing it. I really didn't need to know anything else. And then I had this one sort of unplanned incident. The state of São Paulo in Brazil had this crazy tax change, and it created a tremendous amount of work for our plant in São Paulo to be fulfilling those new requirements. My boss put me in a plane, sent me there, and said, okay, you go write some routines to try to automate some of the stuff those people are doing because they're going nuts. And I went, and 2 weeks later, I had my job done, and I stopped by the general manager's desk to say, hey, I'm done. I'm headed back to Rio. Everything good. I'm not going to complain to my boss when I go back home. And he told me he was really happy with what had happened. And then he asked me, so do you have any idea how much work you eliminated here? And I was honest, and I said, no, I have no idea. I have no idea how much work they did. And then he actually took the time. He took the time to get a bunch of piles of paper and put those on his desk. And he said, all of these things here took this much time from these many people, and now they're going straight to the garbage, because what you did just eliminated all of this, all the work that all these people are doing is gone. Thank you. And that was such a cool feeling for me. Because that was really the first time in my career that I got in touch with this thing. Oh, wow, so I have fun, but it actually helps someone. And this started this theme of addiction to value, right? Because once you get it, you want more of it. And that's sort of been my career. I think back to Andrew's point, is really trying really hard to understand business so that I can understand business value. And we'll talk a little bit more about why the technology person doing this versus a business person. But that's really where the addiction to value comes from. Couple of initial considerations. Big data is a term that's used for a lot of things. When I'm talking about big data initiatives here, I'm talking about a lot of data, complex data, that requires some element of data science. right? So if you have a lot of data that goes into a relational database and you generate a ton of reports, that's not what I'm calling big data for the sake of this conversation. It has to include data and data science for this to make sense. The second thing is that you're going to notice that there's a focus here on product and service development. And part of this is my belief that most of big data initiatives that are completed with one goal. They're there to create or enable a new service or to enable a new capability in a product. So there's a deployment piece to that we'll talk about a little bit, which is quite a bit challenging, as some of you may have experienced. So getting those things out of the way. The other thing that I wanted to make clear in terms of biases is that I am running away from this as fast as I can. I've seen it done. I've seen it done with peer organizations while I was at Presbyterian. I saw us doing it at Presbyterian, and I have seen in the last 4 years several clients of all sizes going through the same sort of bait and switch operation of trying to build an analytics program by just dumping money and data into a place and then hoping that people are going to magically find value from it. I don't believe in this model. I think the only thing that happens here is that you're going to spend a lot of money and you're going to take a lot of time. And yeah, you may hit some value, but it's going to be like the lottery, right? You may get 100 cards. You're going to get one that comes with a little bit of money in it, but it's by accident. And what I am proposing through today's dialogue is that data science is looked at in a much more structured framework. And the one that we've been using at PointRight that we chose to deploy is the team data science process, which was created by Microsoft and that I have in this slide. I'm not going to go through this whole thing. It's not really the point of today's presentation to go through a life cycle model for data science. But I do want to point a few things. One is, and especially for people coming from a software development background, which is my case and perhaps some of yours, arrows point all over the place. So this thing is highly interactive and you go back to the drawing board very often. But what anchors this whole thing is this box at the top, which is the business understanding. And every time you hit a roadblock, you go back to revisiting your business understanding. And that drives everything else. That drives your data acquisition strategy. That drives your modeling strategy. And ultimately, your deployment strategy. So with that said, in terms of what I'm trying to move away from, what I'm trying to get to, let's start with value and definition of value. So this is your textbook definition of the word value. And I use that a lot because I'm English as a second language, so I have to resort to the dictionary probably more often than you guys do. But this is what it means. It's the relative worth, utility, or importance. Easy, right? But then I was reading this data IQ survey that says that 1 in 4 businesses expect data science to impact top line revenue by 11% or more. So that's great. 24%, 25% of our businesses expect a good top line impact. But you see the second line, 1/3 have no idea. And the bottom line, when you ask data scientists what their biggest challenge is the weak understanding or support for data science in business. And if there's anybody here from IT is a close second. We're not going to talk about that, but that's a close second in terms of frustration for data science teams. So let's go back to the business. So weak understanding or support for data science in business. So let's talk about the business perspective. I think there's a misconception. Whenever we talk about business value, it's something that's the responsibility of the business. And in my experience, that really just doesn't work. And I think it's getting worse. As I get old and I see technologies advancing, especially in the data science space, I think the first bullet point is true. And I would encourage anyone who thinks that's not the case to speak up. And this is probably a good public participation part of the presentation. I do not believe that in current state today, that business can fully understand the potential for these technologies. They just can't. They're not trained to do this. They are incapable of doing it.
I agree wholeheartedly.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Right.
Thank you. So it's not their cup of tea, right? Technology leaders, I believe, with time. Now, if you keep turning around, CIOs or CTOs or VPs of analytics every year, you're not going to get there. But with time, a good technology leader will get business value and will understand business value. And I believe that technology leadership, and you can change that from technology leaders to analytics leaders, big data leaders, but anyone who's heading these initiatives, it's really their job to bridge that gap. The gap that led to the 30% have no clue, and then all these data science teams that are frustrated because their business areas don't know how to use them, right? So who bridges that gap? I think it's really the technology leadership. If that's the case, then I think we have a tool for that. And that's stakeholder management, right? So a lot of people have seen some version of this. This was pulled from the TOGAF or the Open Group website, or Open Architecture focus group. Very simple, PMI has a version of this. But basically you take all the stakeholders in your big data initiative and you group them into these 4 groups. For the sake of the value discussion that we're having, what you want to know is who is going to judge what's value? Who's going to decide that what we're delivering through these initiatives means value to the business? And you need to be crystal clear about that. Because if you don't identify those folks up front and you're not engaging with them as a leader of this initiative to understand what they perceive as potential value and to educate them on what maybe you perceive as being potential value that needs to be vetted by them, you're missing the point. You're going to be talking to people that probably don't matter as much. So I'm a firm believer. I'm a big fan of stakeholder management for a bunch of things. I've worked as a project manager for a long time. And this is, I think, one of the best project management tools that you have to understand who you're dealing with and who's out to sabotage your project and who's out to support it, right? So I'm a big fan of using the same framework for identifying who you need to involve to start defining where value could come from in your big data initiative. Then some different dimensions of business value. And we'll talk a little bit more about how the top one is sort of the overwhelming preference of executive teams when it comes to funding these initiatives. But obviously, financial return or ROI, customer experience, but you will see in a little bit, as long as you can tie that to the financial return. Because customer experience by itself is not going to move the needle. Nobody's going to give money for something that's not going to move the needle. Risk avoidance, what happens if this thing doesn't get deployed? That gets funding. In other here, I added employee productivity. This is something that showed up. I was showing it in a chart, some of the top measures that people are using for these initiatives. And this one is showing up as something that's growing. Probably very small still, but we'll get there. Also around value, whenever we're working with technology initiatives and we're working with these advanced technologies, we're always looking at value. This whole presentation is about value, right? But I don't think we can afford to not talk about risk management anymore. I think we have gotten to a point in the evolution of these technologies where, to quote Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, the whole move fast and break things mantra. I don't think that works anymore, because these things are being broken or big, and they're going to be very difficult to be fixed. And so I think that while the focus is obviously on value creation, you have to understand where there's risk. So as part of your value creation exercises and analysis and assessment, you really need to understand, is there a long-term business impact? Are there ethical considerations with what you're doing, especially in the use of data science? I think this is something that's becoming more and more. We're moving from a society that was always asking, can we do it? Are we capable of doing it? To a society that can do probably more stuff than we should. Right, so I think we need to start asking ourselves, yeah, we can do it, but should we really do this? Are the consequences worth it? And I think if they were doing that at Facebook, they probably would have made a few different calls with regards to their monetization of data. Okay, before we leave sort of the value creation or value definition segment, I wanted to share with you something that I've used before. So when you create this concept of value creation opportunities as part of working with your key stakeholders, you're going to need to figure out a way to document these, because you're going to have to go back to those. You're going to have to further define them. You're going to have to be able to, quantify the value of each one of these things. And so I found it very useful to have a little template that includes, the format doesn't really matter, but it includes this type of information. So you have an opportunity with a name. You have an owner, which can be an executive or it can be an area that owns the opportunity, which means they own the generation of value ultimately. You describe it, you describe the specific analytic capabilities that you need in order to enable that opportunity, and what is a value proposition, right? What type of value dimension is being touched through this value creation opportunity, and how much value are we talking here, so that you can start comparing these one to another and start prioritizing later when we talk about planning. Okay. Before we move on to quantification, anything around value definition that I left out, or that anybody through their experience would like to add to the conversation? I think we have a small enough group that we could probably do that. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so why do we need to quantify that? Well, firstly, because the stuff is too complex. If you're responsible for a big data initiative of the type that we're talking about here, these are probably the skills that you have under you. You have solution architecture, you have in analytics, you have your data management people, your data science people, you have product and engineering with product management, development, you have your operations people that are going to maintain whatever it is that you're building, and more, you have security for all this stuff to make sure that everything is super tight, especially depending on the market that you're focused. If you're in healthcare, for example, security is a big deal. From an architectural perspective, if you're building something with big data, more than likely you're looking at an application architecture that looks like this. And what you're doing is you're probably building a new service tier into your platform, which is your whole AI and ML service tier. And if you don't do that, if you just do this one at a time, your deployment is going to be so long that you're going to have zero usability. By the time you're ready to deploy your predictive models, the world has changed. They no longer predict anything. You have to go back to the drawing board and model them again. So this stuff is expensive. Technology is expensive. Skill sets are expensive. More expensive than most technology initiatives that are just about developing software. And because of that, people need to quantify what are they getting from it. And also this from the Data IQ survey that I mentioned to you guys, these are the top 6 measures that companies, and this was very focused on Fortune 100 companies, but these are top 6 measures that these companies are using. So if you start looking at, there's a mix here. The first one, and I think this is a little unfortunate, is sort of the very immature state of rating things at a project by project basis, right? So you're just looking at the return from each project and you're approving things on a project by project basis. It's good, you need to do that. But you start looking at number 2 and you start looking at number 3, those are much more mature metrics. So now you're evaluating your capabilities in terms of what they're doing to a whole process or what they're doing to a whole product or a service that you provide. And then you start getting to 6. I was actually going to do just the top 5, and then 6 picked my attention, because even though it's a distant 6, companies are starting to wake up to the fact that there can be huge gains of employee productivity that aren't associated with just selling your stuff to clients, that can be brought by data science. Anyone surprised by anything that you see here? Anyone surprised by the obsessive focus on money? And this includes...
Not surprised at all. I mean, money is a measure of value, so that's one of the metrics that's used with it.
Yeah. And sort of going back to my initial point, this stuff is very expensive. I mean, a lot of these things are now possible because you have, you know, Azure, you have AWS, or you can provision a lot of the compute capacity that you need to run, you know, these big data initiatives and build these models with neural networks that are deep neural networks and that require a level of compute that a few years ago you'd have to have millions of dollars in investment just to buy the hardware to run this stuff. Now you can do it, it's great, but it's still expensive, and it's still expensive from a resource perspective. So that's why there's such a focus on money. And then, so let's say you went through the whole thing, right? You defined where you can get value from, you worked with the right people, you quantified it, you identified the right dimensions, you got people excited about all this stuff. But now with big data, you have another problem, which is the problem of attribution. Remember, when you're doing technology solutions that are automating processes, it's a very easy ROI factor, right? You eliminate these many people, that's the cost associated with that, that's the return that you're generating on investment. Here, more often than not, you're not automating things, you're enabling things. And that creates a challenge that you don't have with other technology projects, because insight does not create action, and action cannot exist without insight. So it's the proverbial chicken and egg problem here. So very often the way this manifests itself is that by the time you're done and you are super happy that you have a very tight case for building this new capability, the operations person comes, hey, wait a second. It's me, it's my area that's actually making that happen. It's not the analytics. So you create this conflict, right? Because you just delivered all of this stuff, but it's true. If people don't use the analytics, nothing's gonna happen. So yeah, there's a point to that. So how do you solve the dilemma? Because if you can't attribute any value to the insights that you're creating, you're never gonna be able to fund anything. And if you can't fund anything, then your operations are gonna be stagnant. So how do you get out of this? I don't think there's a clean way, to be honest. But this way is one way that I have seen work. We use that actually at Press, and I've seen it work, and I think it's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. And that's basically using an arbitrary model for attribution of value. And one that, you know, when you go to the people in your stakeholder management chart that really call the shots, those are the people that are going to be agreeing to whatever model you build. But you build a model that's effort and cost driven, that is agreed to by consensus at the governance level, that everyone understands is imperfect, and that takes into account the cost and the effort of R&D, deployment, and operations. So this is sort of abstract. So I wanted to give you a more concrete example. So let's say in scenario one, it takes you a year to build some new predictive capability. It takes you 2 weeks to deploy. Your operations is working with existing FTEs in minor process changes. And you need to sort of split the baby. I would say that in this case, you know, the capability here gets a lot of credit for this because, you know, operationally, it's not a major lift. And it was a pretty substantial lift of working for 12 months to deliver this thing. In scenario two, you have sort of the opposite scenario, right? It only took you 3 months to come up with these new models, but it will take 6 months to deploy, and you have to hire a bunch of people, train them, and develop new processes and all of that. So probably in that scenario, it makes sense to give operations more in attribution of value for whatever you accomplish, whatever value gets created with this capability than zero, right? So that's the way. It's not perfect, but as long as people agree up front to what rules of engagement they're going to follow, and on a case-by-case basis, as soon as you define and you quantify your value, you follow that with a question of, like, how are we going to split this one? I think it puts you in a much better position than to just have the political infighting that comes when you don't have a slightly more objective approach to doing this. Okay, so we've gone through how you define value, how you quantify value, how you can attribute value. So hopefully you have a list of value creation opportunities that you're dealing with in your big data program. And you have an engaged governance group that is ready to oversee the execution. So this is really time to start delivering. Before I get into delivery, any questions on the stuff that preceded this? Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so what makes this thing interesting is that we looked at the data science lifecycle, right? The TDSP, the Microsoft TDSP. The problem is that in order to deliver anything, that's not the only thing that you're managing, right? You're actually managing two life cycles concurrently, because once you have what you need from the left-hand side, the work begins on the right-hand side for you to productize that. And when you start putting the people that are used to the arrows moving in one direction and the people that are used to the arrows moving in every direction in the same room for the first time after the people on the left-hand side are already done, guess what? You're adding a tremendous amount of time, friction, and knowledge transfer to this whole thing. So I don't think people can afford to do this with a waterfall perspective, where you do your data science work, then you do your development work. That just doesn't work. Instead, and this is something that we do in a small scale at PointRight, we have what we call research coordination. So in research coordination, a cross-functional team that includes data scientists, include people that do product, and in some cases will be service management, in our cases product, subject matter experts, solutions architect, development, on the same group from the first day that we start talking about this new data science initiative. And in my book, what that does is that it gets the data science people to drive the process, which they need to, because your software developers, architects, product management people, they may know everything there is about the product and how to build it. They are not data science experts. They don't understand the process that we need to go through to go from point A to point B in data science. And at the same time, your data science team doesn't really have the connection to the product and to the business to understand where there's value. So by cross-pollinating this thing up front, you start teaching everyone what they don't know, exposing a lot of information up front to people. And I'm a big fan of exposing half-baked information to people up front as a way to accelerate things, as opposed to waiting until you have everything pristine, perfect, and now you're ready to share that with people and just wasted all that much time, because the 80-20 rule applies to everything, right? Okay, as I said, collaboration. This is driven by product and service management, focus on value. Those are the guys that are going to ensure that happens. And facilitated by the data science team. So the process efficiency and the process integrity is maintained. You want to be able to defend these things. And the second you go to a client and say, yeah, I have a predictive model in my product that predicts patient falls. The first question is, how do you know the model works? How often is your model right? If you don't have integrity in that process, you're not going to be able to pass that type of scrutiny. And the last piece here, which is really important, is the education that happens through this process. Remember when you talked about the survey data that showed that businesses don't know what to expect in terms of benefits from data science. Data scientists are frustrated with the lack of understanding coming from the business. There's a lot of education that's required on both sides, right? The data science teams need to be more business versed, and businesses and business leadership needs to be more technical in understanding, what they have available to them. So this, I think, precedes any type of planning in big data initiatives for you to not create a huge lag between your data science project and your deployment project. Okay, planning model. This is something that I think is valid for pretty much every type of technology initiative, but with data changes so fast that you can't rely on your traditional steering committees with waterfall project management and toll gates and change management and scope changes. And I worked with that stuff for a long time. That slows things down too much. You need to have a very strong governance. And when we talk about very strong governance, that means a group of 100 people. Especially you want small groups. And in some cases, you want one person, if it's a small organization, that can make all the calls for you. So this doesn't have to be big, but you need to have very clear governance, which is the group of people that are going to make calls in the sun. The way they're going to be working is they're going to keep the focus on value, and I'd like to have a quarterly cadence for these groups. I work with roadmaps, which is the second part here. I don't do any super detailed planning for any of these capabilities up front. They live in a high-level roadmap that's no longer than 18 months because we're not smart enough to predict what we're going to be doing after 18 months anyway. So let's not pretend that we are. And let's focus on a quarter-by-quarter basis. Let's look at what we had in the roadmap. Does it have to change? No. Let's put together a quarterly release plan. Let's deliver the stuff on the next quarter. Next quarter, we'll look back at the backlogs, at the roadmap. We let the business, we let the governance group reprioritize things to no end, because we didn't invest that much to start with, other than putting stuff on the roadmap. And I think this gives the business the sort of flexibility that they like to have to drive these initiatives. And it also gives us the flexibility to respond to things that change. Maybe we try to build a capability and that backfires on us. A lot more often in big data initiatives do you not hit your goals than in regular technology initiatives. Usually when you embark on software development projects, you're going to come out of it with something that's fairly close to what you started in mind. With these things, after a couple of iterations, it may come to the conclusion that, yeah, it was a great idea, except that the data quality is terrible, or there's no data governance that ensures that there's standardization in place for this. So, yeah, sorry, great idea, can't do it. What are we doing instead? So this thing needs to be very agile. And then execution, right? So it went from your roadmaps to your quarterly execution plans or quarterly release plans. I am a big fan of Agile for data science projects and for software development projects. I think both Scrum and Kanban are probably the two most used frameworks in this space. And at PointRight, we use the DevOps model to sort of glue everything together. So we have our traditional software development teams doing development work using Scrum. We have our analytics team that's doing their own iterations, Scrum-like, of TDSP or the team data science process. We have that research coordination team that's sort of orchestrating things that are happening on both sides. And we have governance at the top that's making the calls in terms of what goes next, so that we get the value that we need out of this thing. In my mind, the DevOps model, for those of you that are familiar with it, is a fantastic way for you to combine different life cycles and different frameworks. And it's very agile friendly. The other thing that this does is that DevOps is very focused on continuous delivery. So you're not looking at these rigid release schedules that are going to happen once a year, twice a year, because you're probably not going to be able to hit those when data science is involved. There's just a much higher level of unpredictability that comes with those initiatives. And they integrate those processes really well on the DevOps front. So that's how I go through planning, how I go through execution of these types of initiatives that you ended up in your roadmap. And I think that takes us to the end of this, with about 15 minutes for questions, discussions, anything that people did not see, anything that you saw that you don't believe is the case, that you'd like to talk about. I think this is really the time.
These are terrific information. Thank you so much. So Michelle, I know we've got some folks who are dealing with a lot of these related issues and have challenges in their own workplace. Michelle, do you want to share some of your thoughts as you're listening to Cesar?
Well, first, I'd like to say that Cesar hit it right on the head of the nail. This is exactly the experiences that we're having at the city of Albuquerque. Our biggest challenge is determining where we're at in our data maturity at the city and how we use data and what we're doing with it. And I think that the points that he brought out hit the nail right on the head, and just really demonstrate what we're struggling with, especially at the government level, at the city level, where we have a few more exterior things that play into how we get work done and who determines what our priorities are.
Mm-hmm. And how do you deal with data issues? Because that's one of the things that, especially in healthcare, gets in the way so often. And sometimes spend so much time and money, and then when you think you're going to have something, you've got everybody on board, and you can't get the data.
Well, that's probably one of our biggest challenges. Not all systems that we have at the city have the same level of data quality and data understanding from the functional areas. Often our functional areas don't understand the data that they actually have and what the meaning and the relationship is between what data is coming in and what you can produce out of it. A great example is right now dealing with some information, combining information from two different systems. Well, system A is the place where we get the tie between this national ID information that we have and their employee name, and another system uses this national ID, but they aren't actually telling the source system what all the IDs are. And so when we run a report, it's like, well, we've got a lot of information that's coming out. What do we do with our nulls? Well, the data is not in the system that we're pulling from, so we can't give you, any good stats because we don't have any of the information in there. And so how do you go about dealing with that? So those are some of the things that we're still dealing with at the city, is really understanding the data and the relationship between how the data comes in and what you can do with it on the other side.
What about others? And has anyone had any issues getting funding for these things? And have you tried some of these things and did they not work? You want to bring those topics in?
Well, one of the things that I've seen a lot and experienced a lot, and this is a way to recognize it and also help break through those challenges. There's a really good book, which probably a lot of you know, is called The Innovator's Dilemma. And it's, it really applies to this kind of scenario. It's like, how do you break through to the new things that are needed? And one of the phrases that I use a lot is, not making a decision is a decision, and it has its own consequence. And if you can apply a cost, a lost revenue, and those types of things to not doing it, in other words, giving them the option of, hey, you have two alternatives. You can either spend X amount, and I think we tend to lose a lot of these battles because we just focus on that, because we don't have the alternative to say, if you don't, that's okay. You don't have these costs and these challenges, but you also have this risk and these potential costs and losses if you don't do it. And then it becomes much more of a balanced equation than just the cost of doing it.
It's a great point. And when we went through this exercise at Presbyterian, to give you an idea, I'd say about 30% of the value creation opportunities that were approved to move forward were approved on the basis that what happens if we don't do it.
Yeah, exactly.
This is Sarah Boisbert, and thank you for a great presentation. I find that we have both, on projects like this, we have both internal and external customers. And could you just expand upon where in your process you bring in input and from who essentially is the customer, and how that travels through the process?
The first point where we get input from the customer is through our client-facing areas. So when I mentioned, let me go back to the slide that talks about the research coordination team, because I think that would. So this cross-functional group that meets, when we talk about subject matter experts, those are usually client-facing people.
Okay.
And they're the people that are talking to clients every day, that are hearing from clients, and the product people are also very exposed to these enhancement requests or where clients would like us to take the product. Up front, that's all we do. We don't actually bring in directly the client into this unless we have something that we just are not sure whether that capability would be of any value, which, you know, sometimes I think it has happened in the last 4 years. There were 2 situations where we weren't sure, in which case the development team cranked out a prototype very quickly. We put that in front of our client advisory board, got some feedback, and brought it back into the process so we could move forward.
Thank you.
But at the stage where you're doing research coordination, in my experience, 80%, 90% of the time, if you have your client-facing people in the room, not your data scientists only, and you have your product people in the room, they're going to be able to represent a lot of what the client would like to see.
Yeah, exactly.
But not having those folks in the room, I think, tends to lead to the type of gap that we were talking about before, right? Where you have the data science people locked in a room being fed twice a day and being asked what they're doing to earn their keep, and the business trying to figure out what they're going to have these data scientists do because they don't really know what they do. Right?
So quick question, Cesar, and it's based on something I've been interested in recently. How does value addiction address knowledge management in an organization? So for example, in any given organization, there's a lot of unknown knowns. And what I mean by that is there's certain individuals in the organization that know things, but it's not part of the collective intelligence of that organization. And so when you're talking about very specific projects and how you can address those projects and bring value, but there's also this cumulative effect. How much intelligence or how much knowledge does the organization have as a whole to be able to address it? And if you can't quantify what you have accumulatively, then how can you address projects as they move forward? Does value addiction address that, this cumulative intelligence that exists in an organization? It's just, there's a disparity between individual intelligence in the organization and then what the organization thinks it knows.
Yeah, I think indirectly it does. I think the most direct thing that you get, Andrew, is out of this research coordination group. You have a group of people that are competent in their disciplines, but these disciplines work together for 6 months, and you're going to see amazing progress in terms of how much they understand about each other's disciplines. So right there, you're going to see a lot of progress. But I think your point is more about sort of where the business is going, right? Where are we going to find value, and whether that sort of helps bridge some of the knowledge gaps that you have in any organization. I believe it does. I believe it does, because what happens is when you have teams that are very clearly marching in a direction, and I think this is what happened with any well-articulated strategy. I think we happen to be talking about one that's aiming toward value here, but anytime you have a well-defined strategy, I think people see the light and they start sharing more information that's relevant for the team to get there. So I think it does help because you're not asking people to say, hey, you're an expert in XYZ, she's an expert in whatever, you guys, talk to each other. That doesn't happen, right? You need to have a point of focus. And I think when you're focused on value, that sort of provides that one goal that everyone is marching toward. And then the knowledge sharing starts happening based on what we need to get there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
So Cesar, did you overlap with Eric Reed, 2 former Presbyterian alumni, well, 3, including Andrew?
Yes.
Did you know Eric Reed?
Yes, I remember Eric. I'm not sure if Eric remembers me, but I remember Eric.
Oops. Sorry, Eric. I think I'm messing you up.
Hi, trying to unmute my audio here. Yes, Cesar did a lot of really great work at Presbyterian.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's a great organization. I learned so much at Press. I wouldn't have been able to do anything after Press if it weren't for the 20 years I spent in that organization.
If I could use my stage here, I was really intrigued, Cesar, about something in one of your earlier slides where you said that you believe that IT was best positioned to cover the gap between IT and business.
Mm-hmm.
And that most people, your implication, of course, is that most people think, well, the business defines the need, and we need business input. Yeah, it was just right there.
Yeah.
Whereas your perspective is it's actually a combination. Yeah, there you go. Business value definition is the sole responsibility of the business, and I see that. I see that even in myself. I think that too, I guess. But you're right. It's probably not. It's a combination, and perhaps IT understanding capabilities more than the business, has a part to play that maybe people don't think about.
Yeah, it's been my experience that's the case because we're not wired for that. I mean, I think most people that I know that work in technology really got into this thing because of technology, right? So it's not our thing. But I think that we just need to be pragmatic, because I think the alternative is just not possible, and it's getting worse. When all we were doing in IT was running payroll. Well, yeah, the business can understand payroll. Right, but now what we're doing is things that we, even in technology 10 years ago, we couldn't dream of. So how can we expect our business owners to actually get this stuff? We need to be the ones.
I think that brings up a good point, that in today's IT world, you can't just know about technology. You have to understand the business that you're supporting. And when I first started out many, many years ago, prior century actually, there were two different groups of people that were in IT. There were those who could run the application and step in if some catastrophe happened. I supported a utility, and so if there was a major outage, as the developer, I could step in and run the application almost, but not quite as good as one of our business experts. If there was an emergency, I was a backup person who could step in and help. Then we had another group of IT professionals at my company who was like, well, I don't even know how the application works. I just go in, I make a little tweak, and then I let the functional tell me whether it works or not. And I think today that perspective doesn't exist anymore. You have to have a really good understanding of how the business works that you're supporting in order to be able to provide the full value as an IT person, to be able to see what technologies exist out there that could help the business. And I think that's a paradigm that we're moving into even more now than we were back when I first started. And it's an important place that many technical people may not want to go, because that requires other soft skills that they may not have.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. But I don't think there's an option anymore. Again, because technology is becoming so complex that I think we've reached that point where it's the only way it can happen. Other thoughts, other questions, challenges?
Cesar, you brought up in the presentation, which is one thing that I've always seen a lot, where you've got the business, people and stakeholders, you've got the technology people, and then there's that big part, that bridging the gap. And I see it a lot where that bridging the gap part, really takes someone, like what you've done and some of the others here, because it really takes a different skill set, because you have to both understand really deeply the business part and also understand how the technology can execute that and what's possible. And so it seems like that is really a key linchpin to a lot of places doing it, is finding someone or having that capability on board that can bridge that gap, because technology is only going to do what you tell it to do. I mean, that's the one thing a lot of technology programmers, IT is, well, at least most of the time, but you know, the stuff does exactly what you tell it to do.
Yeah, it works as designed.
Whether that operation ends up being what you wanted it to be is a different story, but it'll do exactly what you tell it to do.
Exactly. Exactly.
So you know, in that notion, it really does seem like it's a skill set and an area in and of its own, being a person or being able to bridge that gap, because not everybody needs to be able to do that, but there needs to be somebody there who can.
Yeah, you know, I think you have a really good point. There's one thing in my experience, which I think sort of, again, putting the responsibility on the shoulders of technology leadership is that I think that the leader, technology leader, is the sort of first and foremost person to learn business value, right? So that's as part of that person's job. But the other part of the job is to actually disseminate that with the technology team. I've been doing this for a very long time, since Presbyterian and my years at PointRight, where we have monthly meetings with the technology teams, and I usually spend about half of that topic with something related to product that showcases how the business is taking advantage of what we're delivering. It does two things. You know, my development teams really love to get the feedback that, you know, something that they just worked on, you know, generated this outcome for a client. They love to see that. And I think, sort of back to Andrew's point, you start the process of value addiction, right? You start getting people in technical roles to like that connection, to like the win that comes from, okay, we hit the jackpot on this one, we hit the jackpot on this one. That feels good. And I think the technology leadership can provide that sort of feedback loop to the technical teams that don't have the same opportunity to be interacting with the business all the time.
Yeah, per Michael's comment, I actually think that the comment about it's not everybody's job to bridge that gap, I don't know if it's so much that as a matter of degree. So say you have a young developer, the sooner that developer starts to engage the business side and understand, the better, you know, he's going to grow professionally. And I think that's important for them, even to take small steps towards this value addiction very early on. It makes sense to me. So, because what happens is that you know, technologists could become complacent on that person who is like the liaison to the business side, and then they just get used to getting requirements slipped under the door, and that creates further kind of social silos between them and the business, in my opinion.
I completely agree, and it just further sort of deepens the gap.
Yep.
The final interview question I give everyone is, who pays your salary? And it is astonishing how many people don't realize that it's not the bank or the company owner. And at one point I had 2,000 engineers in our laser company, and I only had one person get that right out of 2,000 people. And we need to do better at having people really understand that it's the customers that pay our salaries.
I totally agree. You know, where the brewery where I started working, we had 38 plants all over the country, and we had a centralized administrative area that included technology. So all the software development, all the application development was done in Rio, and then we deployed all over the country, which led to sort of that level of detachment, right? Our technology, there was a reason why I didn't really realize there was value in what I was doing until I was sent to a plant and actually had a chance to work with users. Our director of development at the time had this brilliant idea, and this is a for-profit, obsessed for-profit company. They had this plan in IT where everyone was traveling to a client site, or in our case, an internal client site to a plant once a month to spend 3 days with end users. And there was no prescriptive agenda for anything. You just go there, you spend 3 days there, you come back, you need to produce a report of what you saw that we're doing here that's helping them, what we're doing here that's not helping them. And it's not limited to your areas of responsibility. So talk to anyone in Department X. And everyone in IT was required to do that. The company footed the bill for all that travel, every month for everyone to try to get that level of understanding that they thought they needed. And I think I benefited hugely from that.
Terrific. Any other comments or questions, thoughts you'd like to share? Cesar, I did want to know if you'd be up for sharing your slides with the group and the folks who were not able to attend today.
Absolutely, no problem. I'll shoot this over to you, Deborah, or to Ava.
Yeah, either one would be fine.
No problem.
And may we share your contact information as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Terrific, terrific. Well,
And folks, I'm very passionate about these topics, as you can tell. You guys probably can find me on LinkedIn. If there are things that you want to talk more about this, or you're just curious about something, just ping me on LinkedIn. We'll have a conversation. It's great. I'm always